Hello, I'm Allie and welcome to Crafted Reality, a podcast by Yellow Brick. In this podcast, we are going to be exploring what it means to make creative work in the margins, work that doesn't fit into a neat little box. The podcast will include conversations with some of the leading makers in the world of Larping, street games and multimodal experiences. And we, Yellow Brick, will also be sharing some of our work as we develop projects this year. In time, we hope we can build a community of creatives that are interested in making work that explores the boundaries of situationism and experience. In this, our second episode, myself and co-founder of Yellow Brick, Julian Sykes, continue to talk about the background to the company and also the projects and people that have inspired us to make work in this space. We hope you enjoy.
We are in a new space, so for those of you who are watching on YouTube, this is our new setup, and we have with us our little office dog Bobby, who's a grey whippet. So if you are listening to the podcast, you might hear little tippy taps on the floor, and that'll be her just having a little wander around, mostly sniffing for food. So we're going to carry on just chatting about the things that influence us and the projects that have inspired us in terms of the work that we make. And this week we thought we would chat a little bit about ARGs. So for those of you who haven't come across ARGs, they are alternate reality games. And we thought we'd give you a little bit of a rundown on those.
We came across the oldest ARG probably last.
Yeah.
If we think about Masquerade, I think we learned about that at the end of looking at ARGs and kind of like looking at games and things.
So Masquerade was a book written by Kit Williams, who was an artist, and he'd created this scavenger hunt within the book. So he had placed clues within this almost like illustrative short story, and by putting those clues together, it basically led you to I think it was like a golden hare that you could find somewhere within the UK. So I think that being almost the first iteration of a kind of almost like multi-platform scavenger hunt, really.
So I guess there are some, not necessarily distinctions, but definitely things ARGs have within them. As Ali said, there's that kind of multi-platform nature. We'd probably say Masquerade, in a sense, was the least multi-platform in a sense, because you've got the book, you've got the outside world, and you've got people. But then as ARGs kind of grew, and I guess aligned with the development of the internet, they became far more kind of mapped into the platforms that people use. So that could be forums, that could be social media platforms, as well as then physical artifacts and physical spaces. And I guess the thing they talk about often is this storytelling as archaeology element, where you're kind of uncovering the story of the ARG. And I'd probably say the most important aspect, or the big differentiator with ARGs, is that you'd have to be crazy smart to do an ARG on your own. It needs that community aspect to work together to solve some of the problems. So it's too complicated for the individual, and it's definitely more like a hive mind that's needed to, I guess, kind of solve it. And then I guess the the final thing in some ways, because it lives within the platforms that you're kind of living on. There's this ongoing conversation about it, that it's not a game. So I guess that means that when we say that, it's almost getting to the levels of Larping that we kind of discussed in the first episode, where people are imagining that it's kind of real life. It's kind of part of their routine, it's part of what they are, and it's part of who they are.
What ARGs do is blur the line between reality and fiction, where potentially this could be true, but it is a total fabrication. And I guess that's where it, differs from maybe any other forms, because you are very much integrating the storytelling and mapping it into somebody's world.
And I think we were interested in ARGs, not necessarily to make an ARG, because they can be huge and they can be so complicated that it's almost impossible for a small group of people to kind of like play test it. But we were interested in, at this stage, and this is why we became interested in them, we were interested in maybe how we could bring in, I guess, digital elements into some of our street games. So that could be content beforehand, during, and then maybe even after. And I guess then after Masquerade, which was that in the 60s?
I think it was sort of 70s.
70s.
And I suppose that and other forms of interactive, I guess it's interactive fiction, right? In many ways, where you're blending narrative storytelling and, to a degree, some form of gameplay, or some form of quest, or some form of task that you're inviting your readers or your audience into. So I suppose arguably there is that element of quest or journey or adventure that maybe is at the heart of ARGs.
Yeah.
Is that invitation, right?
Yeah, and then if we kind of like fast forward 30 years, we've got this brand new thing called the internet. We just so happen to have a film created called AI, half directed by Stanley Kubrick, finished off by Steven Spielberg, that has a ARG kind of hidden within one of the movie posters called The Beast. And I guess most people historically, you look at Wikipedia, that kind of thing, this is the one that stands out as being that kind of huge behemoth of, as we said, multi-platform, hive mind community, that kind of thing.
The development team had created rabbit holes for the players or audience to go down. So it's very much that metaphor of the Alice in Wonderland. You're offering pathways for people to be led down and discover things if they so wish. The Beast, in terms of how it was structured, had a kind of web of websites, real world events to engage with, and sort of spanned other media platforms. So it was absolutely massive.
But not that big, in the sense that the people who made the content had made what they thought was going to be months upon months of content, and the players basically consumed it in a few days. They kind of got through it. So that, I guess, there was this kind of, with it being that first project. I think everyone was quite overwhelmed by the ability for a community to kind of, I guess, activate and come together and solve these puzzles. And I guess that's the thing, isn't it? I think it's kind of a test bed for the internet, for forums and stuff like that, and kind of in some ways highlights the effectiveness of something that wouldn't have been testable. So I guess they panicked and quickly started to create more and more content for it.
Remembering this was 2001, before Facebook, before Twitter, and I think it was sort of described as an unprecedented internet event. And I think in terms of the development of it, what the creators were hoping is that it was an extension of this idea of a tabletop game where they, as the puppet masters, could encourage a collaborative storytelling experience through that invitation. And I think, as you said, the key things are this sense of community where you on your own won't necessarily be able to solve it. It has to be done, it has to be managed and solved by the community to be able to make sense of it all. And I guess the premise of this ARG was they'd write a story, they'd create evidence as if this event had actually taken place, and leave this evidence in the digital and the physical world, and then pepper these breadcrumbs throughout those places so that people could find them and discuss them with each other. And that's kind of the magic of these types of things.
And obviously, in some shape or form, people like the idea. In terms of marketing executives like the idea, because 3 years later, Bungie's launching Halo 2, and we've got a new ARG called I Love Bees, and I think you'll see a recurring theme with the ones that are kind of highlighted within the podcast. They're pretty much, all the big ones are pretty much all marketing for something. So we've got the Beast for AI, we've got I Love Bees for Halo 2, we'll come on to one for Why So Serious for the Christopher Nolan Batman film. And the reason for that, and I guess the reason for some of our interest, but also our trepidation of trying to make something as big as this, is that they're so big and so huge. If you're going to make them outside of the context of marketing, then there was this kind of belief that there'd be no way it could be possible to make an ARG that would make money, you know, whether that's actual profit or just generally just like not cost thousands of pounds, and then there'd be no way of kind of making that back. Because I guess it's kind of like, you know, where is the transaction or where is the ticket when you're kind of trying to make these things in a way frictionless, and as Ali said like earlier, like it's meant to be kind of part of your daily life. So it'd kind of be odd for you to suddenly be like paywalled and go, oh, you can't go any further. You know, you have to pay for some additional content. So it's kind of interesting that the sheer scale of them is both its kind of strength as well as its weakness. And it's, I guess it's kind of just generally an issue of the internet, right? You know, until recently, until digital content creators have now got things like Patreon and the join buttons and memberships and stuff on YouTube and things like that, until that recently was added, it's the same issue, isn't it? Like, we're making all this content, but how does anyone actually make a living from it? So yeah, I guess there was 2007 then was the Why So Serious ARG for Batman. That kind of played out for over around about 15 months, concluding in July 2008, and that spanned 177 countries. Millions of people got involved, and I think that one particularly, from the sounds of things, was very much a mixture of digital and physical experiences, allowing heroes to exist online as well as then in the physical real world. And I think that's the one that I always kind of think about when thinking about our street games. There's that story of one of the kind of sets, or one of the kind of puzzles that are solved. There's a group in New York that kind of go to a bakery. They kind of say this kind of secret password. The baker gives them a loaf of bread.
Or cake.
The cake. Mm. And the cake starts ringing, and there's a phone inside. And I think that kind of, just magic feels like what we wanted to kind of provide people within the work that we made. But then it instantly kind of tells you that the only person that could have done that is someone from New York. So it was this kind of I don't know, it's hard to describe, but it kind of felt like they had a great time, but you wonder what the other people in playing the ARG, were they happy for that person, or did they wish they were kind of also at the bakery having the cake?
How do you create a satisfying experience for everyone based off of that? Because I think everybody'd want to go to the baker's and have that experience of getting a cake and finding a phone in the cake.
Sticking your hand straight into the cake and just pulling it apart, yeah.
So I think it's, how do you offer that? And the answer is you can't, essentially, can you? So it's like, how do you satisfy the rest of the experience for the other thousands of people who are playing or who want to take part in a certain way? And I suppose maybe part of that is the discovery that someone has done that, and I guess the responsibility then of the people or person who have had that experience is to document that and then express that experience online to the community. It's their storytelling back to the community, which then forms part of the larger story of the experience of the ARG that sort of fits in then with the themes of the film or the worlds of the film. And those stories that people share are very important, and that's then, I think that's kind of key to these things, isn't it? The community sharing their war stories or their failures or their successes, to win or lose as a community overall. And I suppose that's what a lot of ARGs want to create and want to provide people.
So kind of like those hero moments that are then shared back to either the 5 people you're playing with or even the wider community.
Yeah.
Because as you said, they couldn't be there, but they are still very much involved, or they were the people that were key to providing them the address going back to the bakery, for that bakery and the clue for that.
And without that clue being shared with the community, I guess nobody can really necessarily then progress through the whole thing.
Yeah.
So that individual, that group of people do have that responsibility then to share it, to be able to move their story forward as a community, as a group, and piece things together from that.
I guess it's a bit like kind of almost like if you think of a book and you've got like text for the first few pages and then all the pages are blank, you know, until everyone's kind of like caught up and read their bits, if you like, then that next page doesn't get revealed and so on. But it's everyone that made it, right?
Yeah, I guess you're penning the story, aren't you? You're filling in the journal together.
Yeah, absolutely. And then actually just a bit before Why So Serious, but kind of all within this kind of realm of just pre-iPhone, pretty much. Like iPhone came out in 2007. In 2005, Perplexity was created, and that's a bit of an outlier in the sense that it wasn't for marketing. It was trying to be an ARG within its own right, and to all intensive purposes, it was trying to be a sustainable ARG that was, you know, a game that had a start, middle, and end, had currency, and they'd worked out ways of selling product, or in this case cards, to players that were then in the same way a community group that were trying to progress the narrative and the story on.
And I guess from reading about it, it sounds like that game had quite a nice variety of levels where you'd have these cards and some of them would be just kind of really simple brain teasers, or, you know, puzzles that you could solve maybe yourself, or there were much kind of wider clues to the larger story that you could engage with then also as a community. And then I guess the big thing with that particular ARG, there was a prize to be discovered. I think if you found this mythical cube that was buried somewhere in the UK, you could then basically bag £100,000. So again, it was back to that traditional scavenger hunt, masquerade type interpretation, but through digital platforms to find this prize. But again, it relied on people, I guess, sharing information to potentially discover it.
Yeah, I wonder I kind of wonder with that as well, like if that changes things, you know, because you've got something that is suddenly monetary, whereas the ARGs up to that point are marketing and, you know, this kind of just payoff. I guess Why So Serious, I think there was a big group of people that got free tickets to like a secret premiere for one of the Batman films, but there's no Perplexity. People were paying for these cards, they were paying to develop the narrative. So it would be interesting to know if there was any difference in how that felt. And I guess it's kind of interesting, the director of play for that game, Adrian Hahn, was one of the kind of community leads in The Beast. And he kind of worked with Michael Acton Smith, who then kind of moved on to Moshi Monsters, and most recently is developing or co-developing the Calm app for wellness. So it's kind of interesting where they've come from. And then Adrian Hahn has then gone on to develop Zombies Run, which is described as the most downloaded fitness apocalypse game, you know. I mean, for those that don't know it,
It's niche.
Yeah, very niche within niche. For those that don't know it, it's basically an audio running game where zombies chase you, and through that chasing, it kind of incentivizes you to kind of become fit. It's kind of, Perplexity is definitely a standalone. It's one of the only ones that I've kind of seen that has gone, and the person did find the money.
I guess there was a card within the game that's only recently been resolved in as late as 2020, which was a card where you had a picture of a man, and the card basically said "Find me," and it was an experiment on the idea of 6 degrees of separation. Can somebody somehow find this person who could be anywhere in the world? And somebody did in 2020, because they were still playing the game, because they were determined to resolve and find that individual. And I kind of quite like that sort of commitment to it.
Yeah.
But then also just highlighting the fact of how interconnected we are as human beings, and that kind of is just a kind of like a really nice touch, I think. And then going back to I Love Bees, what was really nice about that, and we sort of touched upon it just a minute ago in terms of how people kind of write their own version of the experience. On the website there were GPS coordinates that were given to payphones, and groups could then go to said payphones and basically unlock part of an audio track that gave part of the story. So essentially, and then that would appear on the website for other people who couldn't go to those locations if they weren't, obviously located near those payphones, or might have been, the other side of the world. People could basically together collaboratively piece together this audio drama, which is kind of a really nice, structure for a game, for a piece.
Yeah.
And I think as time went on, those phone calls became more interactive. So instead of a recording, you interacted then with an actor. So then you could then begin to have a conversation with that actor within this world and ask more questions, maybe find out more content, and again report back to the community to say, well, this is what we found, this is what was said, how does that fit with the overall narrative of the experience that's unfolding.
To that point then, ARGs, as we said, were all marketing, and when we were kind of starting playing games, as we mentioned in the first episode, there was this conversation that we were having about reclaiming urban spaces, and that was part of some of the work that we'd done with Think Arc, which was talking about exploring social good or making projects that have some kind of social benefit. And ARGs started to move into this really interesting arena where they were also looking at problems that might be faced in the future. So there were some ARGs, one of the ones that kind of springs to mind is World Without Oil, where it's literally, as a group collective, playing a game and exploring and discussing if we had in the future, and this is I think 2007 as well, if we had in the future a lack of oil, how would that impact our society? How would things be able to function or not function? What would you prioritize? What would you kind of like have to leave behind? And there was a lot of work, not just ARGs at that stage, but there was a lot of things. I remember reading Jane McGonigal's book. Was that
Reality is Broken?
Reality is Broken. And a lot of games, more street games examples that she put up where we were kind of like reclaiming a graveyard by playing Texas Hold'em, poker, just a crazy game where people are like laying about in a graveyard, kind of playing this game, and then at the end of that then kind of going and kind of cleaning up the graveyard, making sure the kind of brambles have been cut back, making sure all the kind of trees are, you know, pruned, picking up litter, that kind of thing. And it's really interesting mix of like play and social responsibility. We're kind of really interested, we were really, well, we still are, but like really interested in that.
So that idea of the internet for good. I think we now particularly see so many, horrible stories about how the internet is changing our reality or sense of reality in really bad ways, but actually these projects do show, the abilities for humans to come together, to make community, and have that sense of working towards a common goal, very much so. And again, with the example you gave in terms of the street game that Jane McGonigal talked about, that just idea of selfless acts and acts of kindness for no reward, but just for the sake of giving something back, I think kind of is the power of some of these games. And it's kind of, how do we then think of ways to harness that feeling into other things within our world?
Yeah. And then I think then the ARG effectively caught up, if you like, to technology, or technology caught up to the ARG. And what we mean by that is that, as mentioned before, 2007 was the iPhone. Apps had kind of grown and grown in terms of popularity, but the ARG was still this kind of mythical, a sustainable ARG was this mythical kind of thing. It was deemed kind of impossible. And then we could argue that Google and Niantic, with their first iteration of Ingress, which then effectively was taken on or adapted in terms of its mechanics with Nintendo for the Pokemon Go app, has become and still is probably the most kind of popular, well, definitely the most popular street game out there. And I think you could push it to say it's an ARG. I mean, there's not necessarily complicated puzzles and things like that, but there's definitely a huge community.
Yeah, and then there's challenges within that, isn't there? And then community days that bring people together to,
absolutely,
tackle a common goal, right?
Yeah, and I guess this is what's interesting in terms of the difference or the lack of being in the bakery in New York. That was possible now because there was no one place for the community event. There was a community event on the first week of the month in every single city. And so no matter what city you were in or what town you were in, you were close to one of these community events because of the nature and affordances of this new technology. They effectively just went, well, this is your microspace game and this is your center and this is where you as a big community will be able to go and fight one of the towers and you'll be able to get one of your like mythical beasts or Pokemon. And I think that link it's definitely there. I think it just feels just slightly different. But then obviously Pokemon Go, there's also the Harry Potter one as well, which I don't think is quite as successful. But by all accounts, the gameplay is probably actually a little bit better. So I think it's kind of now the technology, and I guess the one thing as well that I would say with the Pokemon Go thing is that it's almost this perfect mix of IP, technology, and the type of game you're playing. Like, Ash is literally walking through a wilderness landscape, capturing Pokemon to store in his backpack. that is the IP of Pokemon, and that is the actual game, and you get to basically be Ash or a version of a Pokemon trainer. So there's so many things working for you, and it's not like in Pokemon that there's only one Pokemon trainer. There's hundreds. He meets loads. He meets one nearly every episode. So of course everyone can be a Pokemon trainer in training. So it's almost the perfect storm. And I wonder if that's why that one hit so hard and became so popular. And I guess fair to say probably the first time mass AR or augmented reality existed. We talk a lot about when you're playing a street game, how you start to see your city differently. A street becomes a place that you got caught, or you escaped, or you've solved a puzzle. And in the same way, walking into your park, doing a battle or capturing a Pokemon did, for the first few weeks, if not months, change my experience of those locations. And obviously we all heard some of the stories of people like jumping over people's fences and going into gardens, and Niantic and Nintendo frantically trying to because they never had the warning sign up the first time, did they? Remember on load screen there was no this is a dangerous game, do not walk out into the traffic. And I always remember that first time we played street games, and that warning sign, or that warning instruction to say you're not invincible. If you're in the real world, if you walk out in traffic and a car hits you, that's going to hurt. And they didn't have that, and then you just know from the games you'd be making that will come soon, and 2 weeks later it said, make sure you are
aware of your surroundings.
Aware of your surroundings. Kind of crazy, right? So that kind of was our kind of history lesson of ARGs, kind of where people are today. And in some ways it kind of, there's definitely been others since, the app store kind of set up, but it does feel that they've reduced down literally to kind of it's this app, it's a few websites. The complexity has kind of got less in some ways, because it's easier to deliver by just one thing like the app, and then the app becomes, that your phone, your fake phone, your email client, all that kind of stuff. So in some ways, just pre-iPhone, we'd probably say is the heyday of these kind of genuine multi-platform ARGs. Pokemon has changed the game, really. But there's a similar thing that we had while we were kind of making our games and looking at these games. And while on a much smaller scale, we had very similar issues with how it would be possible or impossible for us to make street games that were also sustainable. And bearing in mind we're talking about potentially a street game that having 12 to 24 locations, actors or equipment in each one of those locations, probably someone outside as well, looking after security. So we've got this huge manpower cost of locations, cost of kit, potentially cost of costumes, that kind of stuff.
And I think with the broader online presence before, during and after, you've got a huge kind of content burden of how much content you can create and how long it takes for audiences to consume that content. And, people can kind of burn through that quite quickly. And then you realise to create the fabric of a believable world, how far do you actually go in terms of how much content you actually create and exists online to make it feel real?
But I guess it's fair to say that that burden became kind of unmanageable for us in terms of either making it ourselves and kind of like getting people to help us out, paying them the amount of money they needed to be paid, and then selling tickets to that level. So we kind of started looking at different ways that we could still make a story experience that would still hit a lot of people, would still have this kind of idea of community, but maybe not rely so much on, I guess, physical things, right? And I guess as with all the work that we've done, again, we went and saw a lot of stuff that kind of inspired us to kind of maybe start looking at ways that we could take people on journeys through locations and spaces in a similar way to a street game, but maybe in a slightly more controlled manner.
A lot of the projects that we looked into just happened to be audio projects at that time. So we did a few experiences in Bristol by Of Circumstance, which is led by artist Duncan Speakman, who creates these beautiful audio soundscapes or realities, I'd say, in locations. And we did a few of his
subtle mobs.
Yeah.
Classified him as this kind of anti-flash mob. And there'd be people all listening to audio, potentially up to 4 different tracks. But you could tell people were involved somehow.
Yeah. It's almost like you could identify potentially the people who were there for the subtle mob, but then the idea of the subtle mob being that everybody else, members of the public, would not know it was happening. So this subtle disruption then of public space was kind of fundamental to the idea of those audio experiences. And I remember we did one in Bristol shopping centre.
Cabot Circus.
Cabot Circus, that's right, yeah.
Cabot Circus is kind of like this interesting open closed shopping centre area.
Yeah, part inside, part outside.
Yeah, so kind of covered, kind of not covered. So, and there are 2 ends to it, aren't there, basically? And we were kind of looking out at the far end.
Yeah, because it directed you to the exit and then asked you to look back into the shopping centre. And then you just sort of began realising how many people were actually doing the audio experience, because you had then these little sort of crowds gather of people just looking down. And I remember just looking down, and this member of the public just came up to me, stood within this gathering, and then started looking down into the shopping centre. And then he said to me, "What's going on?" And I said, "I've no idea." And he just did that for ages, just to kind of catch a glimpse of something, because everybody's attention was drawn to that part. And I don't know, it's kind of this beautiful choreography of people in space through the architecture of the city, which I think we found so interesting in some of the pieces. I remember directions like, the camera pans, and you kind of get this sense of the cinematic within these experiences through words and through composition. And it's done so well. And it's, again, I think plays on that idea of when you're walking down the street listening to some music, that becomes the soundtrack to your day, that becomes the soundtrack to you walking down the street, and you're being placed in this very cinematic space. I mean, that's how I think of it sometimes when I walk down the street listening to certain music. You kind of play the things out in your head in that way.
When we started looking at audio, and we kind of experienced some of the audio pieces by Duncan Speakman and Anagram, and kind of we'd made audio work as well within some of the games that we were doing, specifically making some kind of mini games that would dull different senses and things like that, and even heighten some senses, it became this kind of interesting thing where, unlike LARPing, we were kind of trying to put people into situations and we were asking them to kind of react as themselves in those situations.
LARPing being live action role play.
Yeah. And I think we there are a few things with the audio that we really responded to. And I guess the major one, in a sense, was that you had 2 hands free and you had your eyes free. So unlike something like Pokemon Go, you're not looking at a screen or a little map on the screen. You're kind of in a space with the audio looking at the location, and it's kind of magical to kind of, as you were saying earlier, the soundtrack to your life is being played while you're kind of walking down this street. And it felt a lot more emotional, or it felt a lot more like you were feeling things. And it kind of reminded me then and now back to when I was in university at the kind of early 2000s, where there was this discussion about whether design was art and art design, and that kind of moved into whether games were art and so on. And the conversation was about, I guess, ultimately about function. So, for example, there was this piece of work done by a designer who created the most exquisite self-harm kit for their graduate show. And now, obviously, the design of the self-harm kit was functional and effective, but the vehicle or the delivery method of that product was to bring awareness to the fact that self-harm was taking place. And therefore, in a true design sense, the function is obfuscated from the function. And we could argue that art is always that obfuscation. It's kind of highlighting a thing, making something inspired by that, and trying to share that with the world to say, look, this is what I believe in, take notice, if you like. And I think then at that same time, there are a number of design communities or groups, one of them being a Netherlands-based design group called Droog. They're still going. And they've kind of interestingly moved more and more into art. But they were looking at designing products that would emote emotion. So a car door that, because of the angle of the door and the shaping of the metal, as you closed that door and left, it would look sad. I'm pretty sure Sony looked at with them or a different group, they looked at an alarm clock that had its own mind. They would just wake you up at random times. And then there would be products that were, even the process of designing was interesting, where they were starting with an emotion and then saying, now design a lawnmower, for example, that makes you happy. So the emotion first and then the product. And that kind of, I think, was bubbling away. And then I guess your practice has kind of developed massively recently as well. Or I guess not necessarily developed, more like you've also gone back to something that you've kind of stopped for a while, but you did loads of in university, and that's like yoga.
Yeah.
So it's kind of these kind of things, almost like as the Cylons and Battlestar Galactica would say, it just kind of going around in circles, right?
It's happened forward, happened again.
Yeah, exactly. And looking at the way specifically you can create emotion in work, and rather than necessarily looking at traditional beats of a story.
Looking at a mindfulness within that, so that you can draw people's attention to everyday things in terms of, you know, the cycles of the moon, or the cycles of, you know, the sunrise and sunsetting, the things that we take for granted that we can bring people's attention to. And again, we spoke about this in the first episode, street gaming, bringing you to a new part of the city. It's always been there, but maybe you just haven't seen it in that light. And again, the same thing with Duncan Speakman's audio experiences, drawing your focus and attention and framing that perspective in a very different way to give you a different experience of something that you might know quite well, or you might be experiencing for the first time.
Yeah, and I guess know quite well is kind of interesting, right? Like, to what degree, in what angle, at what time of day, all those kind of things kind of change your perspective of something. You know, a street in bright sunshine on a sunny day looks fantastically welcoming, and then in the evening, wet, cold, a few people down in the corner, suddenly has a totally different feel. So I think that's kind of like interesting to explore. And I guess specifically some of the work you're working on recently, looking at how narrative is definitely there, but it's not necessarily the vehicle to provide emotion. Would that be kind of fair to say?
Yeah, I guess what we've sort of started thinking about, particularly now, is moving from storytelling to story feeling. So how can we reclaim that so that we can invite people to feel something rather than them being told something as traditional storytelling? You know, there's a more active invitation for audiences to feel that emotion, just as you were saying with the way to design, you know, something that makes you happy. How can we create things that take people on a journey in terms of, you know, that's very much in their sort of heart and soul, rather than it being an intellectual experience or something that, you know, you have to think about. It's a kind of more basic but powerful way to think about experiences and how people interact with them.
And we'll hopefully be talking a little bit more about that in our next episode, when Hannah McPake, who created Rise and Dyad, or Rise Set, that has become known as Dyad as 2, in next month.
Next episode, yeah. So that was a nice segue. Well done.
I think that's it.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to Crafted Reality with me, Allie, John and Julian Sykes. We hope you enjoy the podcast. Please give us a like and share with anyone that you think might be interested. We'll see you next time.